Women's roles in society have always been inferior to those roles of men. The Civil War was the first time in history women began to break away from the social norm and begin to play a significant role in the military. Rather than focusing on managing their family lives from inside the home, women concentrated on their new lives outside the home. Society's version of womanhood was forever changed after they saw the needed involvement of women in the war. Both women fighting for the Union and the Confederacy had similar motivations and roles in the Civil War, but there were some differences. Prior to the war, Northern women have begun to be prominent in multiple industries, including textiles, clothing, and shoemaking. Due to many men off at the war, more openings opened up for jobs in these and many other industries. Before the war, women made up roughly 1/4 of the employees in the manufacturing workforce, but when the war started, they increased to being 1/3 of the employees. Women of the Union often organized ladies' aid societies in which they would supply food, clothing, or cash in order to contribute any way possible. They also rolled bandages from local hospitals to send to injured troops. Whether it was donating, fighting, or being nurses, women were always yearning to help the cause. About 20,000 women in the white working class and free and enslaved African American women contributed by being laundresses, cooks, and matrons, and nearly 3,000 women of the white middle class worked primarily as nurses. These women were not taken lightly. Age, health, and physical requirements must be met in order to work for some nurses. These women strived to be as involved as they possibly could when it came to tending to wounded soldiers. Thanks to Florence Nightingale and her partnering nurses, Northern women were inspired to get on the front line to care for and to treat injured soldiers. Women got this right in June of 1861 and were on their way to bigger and better roles in the military. Due to the less money and resources in the Confederacy, many women's organizations had to do their work on their own. Like the Union women, they had to cook and sew for their soldiers, along with provide the uniforms, blankets, sandbags, and other supplies for the entire regiment. The women in the war had taken the jobs and roles that were previously held by men. Women saw this as an opportunity they couldn't pass up, so they took their opportunity and strived at it. With the men gone in their homes, women gained confidence at the home front. They were forced to presume the roles of the males in the house. Women had to manage their homes, plantations, farms, and businesses. By working on these industries, the women were able to supply food and uniforms for the soldiers. Confederate women also contributed to the war by making more men sign up. Often, women encouraged their husbands and males in their lives to enlist in the war by appealing to their sense of manhood as an honor. Women also sometimes stated that they would only date or marry those men who volunteered in the service in order to motivate more men to enlist and help the South. Due to many of the battles during the Civil War taking place in the South, Southern women were forced into the middle of the war unintentionally and became nurses on the front line. Anywhere they saw fit became a hospital. The Confederate women did everything they could to help the South's cause. There were many astonishing women involved in the Civil War, famous for vastly different things. Just some of the examples include Harriet Beecher Stowe, an abolitionist who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin; Harriet Tubman, a runaway slave and conductor of the Underground Railroads; Mary Todd Lincoln, the wife of President Lincoln and the First Lady during the war; Lucretta Mott, the first president for the American Equal Rights Association; Clara Barton, a nurse during the war that established the American Red Cross; Rose O'Neal Greenhow became one of the most renowned spies; Louise May Alcott served as a nurse in the war; Susan B. Anthony helped in the women's suffrage rights; and Elizabeth Cady Stanton was an abolitionist mainly for women's suffrage. These were just a few examples of the great women during the war. Although most women involved in the war worked as nurses, a small portion decided they would do anything to fight as a soldier. At this time, women were not allowed to become soldiers, so they had to disguise themselves as men. There is assumed to be somewhere between 400 and 750 women that fought on the front line. Historians argue that women soldiers often acquired the same motivations that men acquired when joining the war. Many different sources of motivation contributed to this phenomenon. Since in normal society, little rights were given to women, they saw this as an opportunity to finally be considered equal to men. This was their way to freedom. Oftentimes, when women did join the war as men, it was due to the loved one enlisting and they did not want to say their goodbyes. Women saw excitement and adventure in breaking the law and going against the rules. Money and sheer boredom were also sources of motivation. Women wanted the reliable wages that came from it after they served. Their boring lifestyles made women thirst for a sense of adventure. Many challenges arose when trying to keep their disguises. The women not only had to learn how to fight as soldiers, but they also had to learn how to take on the identity of a male. Many women were worried about the fact of not looking manly enough to pass as a man. Women were often worried their size would give them away because they were typically smaller than the men in the war. It would also happen where women would end up pregnant and in the war, so they had to deal with both the birth of their child and still trying to remain the identity of a man. Women were afraid to get intoxicated because they thought they would say something or act a certain way that would give away them being a female. To make it more believable, the women also flirted with other females so that men wouldn't think anything of it. Keeping their disguises throughout the war, along with fighting, was a major struggle for the women. More opportunities allowed the women to keep their disguises during the war. Having to wear baggy and heavy clothing helped hide the body shapes of both the men and the women, so it was more challenging to tell the difference between the two. This greatly reduced the chances of being discovered. The women's inability to grow a beard was just seen as adolescents. They were mainly just seen as good-looking boys or soldiers. Women had to obtain a vastly different personality and character in the war compared to their lives back at home. For example, they would have to sometimes get into fights and curse. They brawled whenever they saw it necessary in order to keep their identity. Women even took up drinking, tobacco, cursing, gambling, and fighting, and other primarily bad male habits. Those that could hold their liquor were more easily disguised as men. Women were also put to an advantage if they were previously involved in a more manly and physically harder job when they were back on the home front. Disguising themselves as men was not an easy thing to do, and it is incredible that so many women took part in it. Women frequently would be discovered when injured and sent to field hospitals for care. For example, Clara Barton, who founded the Red Cross, was discovered when being treated for a chest wound. Discovered women would usually just be sent home from the war without punishment, except for a few that were imprisoned or institutionalized. Women's involvement in the Civil War greatly aided the soldiers.